Clark never wrote his own story. All of these deceptions, all of these deceits, the creation of, let's list what he did. He did the Commandos, US Rangers, SAS. I think he can take a large credit for creating the CIA, because he was the inspiration behind OSS, because he met Colonel Wild Bill Donovan. So extraordinary character, extraordinary. And there's something there that I think people don't, I'm going to borrow a phrase a friend of mine used, which is military entrepreneur, the creativity of these people, which is not something you necessarily associate with the British military, particularly the British military in the 1940s, but he was a highly creative individual.
Hello and welcome to the Aspects of History podcast. My name's Oliver Webb-Carter and I'm the editor and your host. Now today I'm speaking with Tom Petch, author of Speed, Aggression, Surprise, The Untold Secret Origins of the SAS. Now some of you may have enjoyed watching the TV show on the BBC, SAS Rogue Heroes, and so you think you know the real story. Well, as I've been discovering, there are many different characters involved in the founding of the iconic regiment. Tom gives a different perspective because he looks at one character in particular, Dudley Clark, a flamboyant and entertaining individual who learned all about guerrilla tactics as a young man and then applied that thinking to the early days of the Second World War. In fact, he gave the commando units of the British Army their name, having been influenced by the Boer commandos of the Anglo-Boer War. Tom is also a filmmaker and wrote, produced and directed The Patrol, which is a fantastic film set in Afghanistan and following a small group of officers and men as they deal with a highly stressful situation. So we talk a little bit about that. Now Tom served in the SAS, so he knows a thing or two about this kind of thing. And whilst he sadly couldn't reveal too much about his time with the unit, his book on its development is fascinating and lots of fun, with many stories that I wasn't even aware of. There is even a character who my own grandfather had a few problems with. Coming up, I've got John Sayles on 18th century Scotland and America. Miranda Mallins and Paul Lage chat all about the 17th century. And I'm also planning on a special on the Parthenon marbles, of which there's been lots of news in the past few months. Please do subscribe so as not to miss any upcoming episodes, and rate and review if you can. There are notes and links in the show notes, but in the meantime, I'll hand you over to Tom Petch talking about the untold secret origins of the SAS. Tom Petch, welcome to the podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you on, and we're here to talk about your new book, Speed, Aggression, Surprise. Is it SAS Speed, Aggression, Surprise, or Speed, Aggression, Surprise?
No. That is actually just a very good title because it abbreviates to SAS. Of course, SAS is the Special Air Service, as we know, but I thought it was a really good title. I can't actually take credit for the title. I have to confess, my agent came up with that, who's a very talented man. Yeah. But it's a good.
That's title. What they're for.
That's what they're for. Yeah.
Great stuff. Well, I mean, it's interesting because you are a veteran of the SAS as well, aren't you? Yes,
I was a badged member, troop commander of the SAS a long time ago. So my military career ended in '97. So I joined the military as a cavalry officer, which is tanks. Obviously nowadays we don't ride horses anymore. And I did Chieftain, Challenger, Saladin, and Ferret Scout cars, which are a bit outdated now. I was a United Nations monitor. I did a tour of Cambodia, and then I finished up in the SAS. And then after that, went back to my own regiment as an adjutant. So yeah, I had quite a varied military career for 8 years. Yeah,
fantastic. Well, maybe we can talk a little bit about that because there's a subject in this book about selection for the SAS, and I'm always quite interested in that. But let's kick off with sort of the start. I mean, because you served in the SAS. Did that mean you had access to any material for this book, which is about the founding of the SAS?
No, I didn't. No, and actually, funny enough, I was saying to someone else, I didn't really know the history that well when I served. I think it's one of those things where we all do regimental history to a level where you know the basics. So, for example, I knew who Sir David Stirling was, knew who Jock Lewis was, knew who Paddy Mayne was. But the genesis of this book came about because I left the military and joined the film industry, and a couple of things happened. One of which was for a brief while, there was an idea that someone was going to make a film about Paddy Mayne. They actually optioned one of the books. I forget which one. I think it might have been the Hamish Ross. I can't remember which one anyway. And they got me to consult on the script, which I looked at. And the trouble with film, we can talk about that, is they've gone quite a long way from the real narrative. And I went through it a few times. Anyway, that didn't happen. And the other thing that happened is I thought, well, no one's really done anything about this themselves. So I sort of started playing around with the idea of doing a film script myself, which I eventually ended up with something like 170 pages of a script that wasn't working. My wife at that point said, this is a book, because I think once I got into the nitty-gritty of the archive, I realized there was so much material to try and compress it into something that was going to be 2 hours long, and a feature script was tough. I mean, feature script's got to pick a very select area, and I'd found lots of things out about the SS that I didn't know, and a lot of people don't know, which is why I ended up writing the book, yeah.
Well, it reads very well. I mean, it reads very easily, which I suppose maybe because it started out as a film script. I don't know, but it's such a sweeping story that it would be, I guess it would be a good TV series. But
yeah, well, they've made
couldn't fit it in 2 hours.
It'd be a different TV series to the one that's doing the rounds at the moment. No, I think that when I say script, the script I was both the Paddy Mayne option script, the thing I was playing around, were much shorter, and they basically focused around the creation of L detachment, which is the narrative that we all know, because that is the narrative that started with Virginia Carl's his book back in the 1950s, which is called The Phantom Major. And she was a war correspondent. She covered the ground pretty well. There's some inaccuracies in that. Essentially, all of that's really based on something that they call the war diary now, which is a big, thick tome. I've got one here. It's a massive block of. Have you seen one here? I'll show you.
No, I haven't.
And if you haven't got, I don't know if this podcast will, to give you an impression, that is the war diary.
Okay, for our listeners, this is a giant book.
Giant book. And the thing is, that was written up. That was written up because in the SS was being disbanded, and in 1946 they tried to put together a narrative of what had happened. And the trouble the SAS had is because it wasn't a proper regiment, it didn't keep what we call a war diary. So a war diary is actually a legal document you keep in a regiment, in a battalion, and it's recorded daily. So, for example, when I was an adjutant in Bosnia, I had to keep one, and every day I fill it in. And the most bizarre thing I found was when I went to the archive, and I think I must have first gone in something like 2016. I'd never been to the archive to look out the original material. I pulled out the first folder, opened it, went, oh, wow. So in the 1990s, I used all these documents. They're exactly the same: the triplicate war diary, the signal pads, the memo forms, so all of that stuff. But that wasn't what the SAS had, because it didn't have that infrastructure. It was a slightly chaotic startup operation. And so you have to look elsewhere, really, for the history. And I think that's one of the things why the narrative is so sort of spread out and people come at it from different angles.
Yeah. We've had Gavin Mortimer on the podcast, who's written a book that really centers on Sterling and Mayne. And the great thing about your book is that it focuses on other characters that maybe readers aren't so familiar with. In particular, I guess there are many great characters throughout the book, but if there's one, it's Dudley Clark, who
yes.
is just this hugely entertaining figure throughout. I
mean, he is extraordinary. And the thing about Dudley Clark, because he was not allowed to tell his own story, because he was a writer, he was banned. So I said to someone, it's a bit like, in the 70s, the Enigma Code got declassified. And so we all know who Alan Turing is and what he did. And that sort of changed the history of the Second World War, really, because before that, you didn't know we were reading the Germans' mail. This is the same sort of thing. Because Clark never wrote his own story, all of these deceptions, all of these deceits, the creation of, let's list what he did. He did the Commandos, US Rangers, SAS. I think he can take a large credit for creating the CIA, because he was the inspiration behind OSS, because he met Colonel Wild Bill Donovan. So extraordinary character, extraordinary. And there's something there that I think people don't. I'm going to borrow a phrase a friend of mine used, which is military entrepreneur. The creativity of these people, which is not something you necessarily associate with the British military, particularly the British military in the 1940s. But he was a highly creative individual, and in fact, his brother Tibby Clark became a very famous screenwriter. He did Dixon to Dock Green, which was a TV series which became the template for all police procedurals. He wrote Passport to Pimlico, and he won an Oscar for the Lavender Hill Mob. So in that family, that was a very creative family.
Yeah, I love those Ealing comedies. They're brilliant.
Mm.
And Clarke's career begins. Well, he sort of brushes up with the First World War, doesn't he? And that's quite an
Yeah.
important influence on him.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think when you're talking the creation of special forces, you've got to mention Lawrence of Arabia at some point, or Colonel Lawrence, or whatever you want to call him, because he brushes up against him. He actually meets him on an airfield. So the sort of history of Clarke is that he is too young to fight in the First World War. He wants to fight desperately. He joins the Royal Artillery, but he can't get into the war. And he fears the question, what did you do in the Great War, Dad? To which he's going to have to say nothing, because he wants to get married. So he stows away with, unbelievably, casualty replacements crossing the Channel, gets caught in France, sent home because he's too young. And then his next bid is to join the Royal Flying Corps, who are the nascent RAF. But unfortunately, the winter of 1780 is so bad, they don't do any flying training. So instead, he's posted to the Middle East where the weather's better. And he gets missed by an Austrian U-boat who tries to torpedo his ship. And then he lands up in Cairo, which is a very important part of this story, because when you look at what he does in the Second World War, the fact that he's flying a Bristol Scout aircraft, which is slightly unreliable over the desert, and he conks out 3 times and crashes it, is a big influence on how he thinks about coming up with the idea of the SAS, airborne raiding squadron in the desert. So that's Clarke's sort of the start of Clarke's narrative. But at that moment, Lawrence of Arabia is always down the road. He's landed in the Red Sea, and he started British Special Forces, because sponsored by Sir Rex Wingate, another name you might know because he's Ord Wingate's uncle. Sometimes Special Forces sounds like a family business, not just an entrepreneur. But anyway, so he's down there, and he's basically supporting the Arab revolt in a way that you'd probably recognize now, because he's providing them with training, they're providing them with weapons, machine guns, they're providing them with explosives. But that strategy Lawrence came up with himself. The British really wanted him to take Medina, which is down the end of the Arabian Peninsula. But he thought there's no point. He wakes up one night in a tent in a cold sweat with a fever, going, this is just going to be another what he calls wood chopping. So he describes the First World War attacks, the ones in the Somme and at Gallipoli and at the Siege of Kut. He describes those as wood chopping, a massive waste of men against machine gun emplacements. And this is going to be another. And they're going to throw the Arabs against machine guns in Medina. So he scraps that and he says, well, what we'll do, we'll strike the lines of communication, we'll strike the Hejaz Railway. And that's really influential in the Second World War, because that long supply line that he hits repeatedly messes with the Turks, it messes them up. They have to protect it and they can't do it. And that is basically how the SAS is created in the Second World War, to do the same thing, to hit the lines of communication.
So you've mentioned Cairo, and there's the hotel, Shepherd's Hotel, which plays a key part in the story. And it's this sort of very romantic view of war in life in the Second World War in Cairo, early 1940s. There's lots of sort of cocktails and stuff like that as they're setting up the. I guess I've skipped ahead. We missed out the command.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, but the truth is that the truth about Cairo is it's a party town, because Egypt's not a combatant. It's not. They're not going to switch the lights out. There are Italians and Germans still running around Cairo. I mean, if you arrive from the restrictions of the Blitz and blackout and you got to Cairo, you can buy anything you want. and that centers for the officers and the officer equivalent civilian ranks on. It's actually my great grandfather's hotel, Shepherd's. My great grandfather Samuel Shepherd founded that hotel, and so that
it's still there.
No, sadly, it became a sort of representative of all that's bad about Britain in the Middle East, and in the 1950s it was burnt down in a riot. And actually, the hotel itself was built by the architect was a German. He was a Bavarian. And there's an interesting aside actually that I mentioned in the book, that the wings the SAS now wear were borrowed because they were inscribed on the ceiling of the lobby. And if you ever read Carol Mather's book, Where the Grass Keeps Growing, I can't remember the title. Anyway, Carol Mather's book, he describes how he turns down David Stirling and says, I'm not going to join your unit because I don't trust you're going to produce anything, lying on the chaise longues in my great-great-grandfather's hotel. And obviously that's the same spot he recruits Jock Lewis. But sometimes it's a liability because 8 Commando, when they're about to be disbanded, go partying there and they hang out in there and they use the notice board to tell people where they are. So the Germans just read the notice board and they know what the commandos are up to. I mean, you couldn't make it out. It also appears in The English Patient, of course, the film from the First World War.
Well, there are a few characters from The English Patient that are in your book. I guess The English Patient is inspired by the Hungarian explorer, archaeologist.
Yeah, he is Almas Lasek. So he is part of the story because, I mean, the start of the creation of modern special forces. There's 2 starts. In England, there's the Commandos, or in Britain, there's the Commandos, created by Clark. And then in Cairo, there's a man called Ralph Bagnall, which we all know as the founder of the Long Range Desert Group. And Bagnall has been part of that desert exploring community before the war with people like Shaw and the Hungarian, Almasi. And he realizes, before the war, he bumps into, in the desert, an Italian in the middle of nowhere, the wrong side of the Egyptian line, which is a bit fluid anyway, because where Libya and Egypt begin and end in the 1930s is in the middle of the desert when no one's been there, is a bit dodgy anyway. But at that point, Mussolini's, is out there, creating genocide, persecuting the local people and trying to conquer the whole of North Africa. And he bumps into this Italian unit, and the commander of that unit says, as a joke, what fun it would be to go to the Aswan Dam. If we have a war, I'm going to go to the Aswan Dam, I'm going to blow it up. And the Aswan Dam is due south of Cairo. And of course, that would have been strategically catastrophic for the British to lose the water supply. So when the war starts, Bagnall keeps pitching this idea and keeps getting knocked back, which is a theme of the creation of Special Forces. He keeps pitching this idea and eventually ends up pitching it to General Wavell. And General Wavell sees the potential, because Bagnall's idea is actually that this is just going to be an early warning force. They're going to go out into the desert, cross the Sand Sea, which is the barrier that only Bagnall knows how to cross because it's a desert exploring ability, though the Hungarian can also cross it. And but Wavell sees more than this. He sees Bagnall, he says to Bagnall, well, what are you going to do if the Italians aren't coming? He says, well, how about some piracy in the desert? And he then commissions him to create the Long Range Desert Group, which, as we know, goes out, strikes behind then Italian lines. But that wasn't Bagnall's plan, that was Wavell's plan, And we can talk about deception a bit, because essentially the Long Range Desert Group was created to deceive the Italians that we had a big capability in the desert, which we didn't have.
Well, there's loads of deception going on, isn't there? With Clark sort of dropping hints left, right, and centre, and travelling out to other parts of the Middle East to give the impression that there are. Oh well, there's a. Is it? Am I getting it wrong by saying that the SAS is invented before it actually is? In that it is
Yeah. Okay. So I think we have to talk about Special Forces in a bit of a round here, because I think you have to put the early commandos, the Long Range Desert Group, the SAS, they're a bit interchangeable in what Clark's trying to do with all of them. So he comes up with the idea of Special Forces, Special Forces full stop. He has a flat on Stratton Street, Mayfair, and he's working in Whitehall, and Dunkirk happens, and he's working for the chief in charge of the general staff, is a chap called Dill, who he knows from Palestine, from the insurgency in Palestine. And he listens to Churchill's speech, which is, wars are not won by evacuations. And he thinks, well, what are we going to do? Because we're totally stuffed here. You've got von Manstein and Rommel and Guderian on the other side of the channel, all ready to rot. We're stuffed here. What are we going to do? We've got no weapons, armies in pieces. And he comes up with this idea. He calls them subliminal methods. He thinks, well, what we could do is get back across the channel with small units and just start hitting them. He calls them pinprick raids. Lawrence of Arabia, same thing. He used to call them mosquito stings. And that way we will be able to dissipate the might of the German army. We'll just keep them guessing as to what we're up to, and we'll be able to hit them in their ports. And that idea, he calls the commandos, because he comes from South Africa. His family come from South Africa originally. His family were in the siege of Ladysmith. And of course, what we know about the commandos is they were the Boers. So after the siege of Ladysmith, which is the Boer War, I'm jumping around quite a lot, so I'll just keep jumping. Slow me down if I get it.
The listeners are experts in South Africa. We just had a chat with Saul David about this.
I love War. That. The Zulu War. What a terrible cock up. Yeah. I love it. And obviously the film. Anyway, let's get off subject. Right. So we know about the Boer War. We know about the Boer War. And the thing about the Boers was they raced off into the veldt. And rather than giving up, they formed small bands of men, which, funnily enough, hit the British. They were very mobile, hit the British, and they were, again, pinpricks or mosquito stings, what Lawrence of Arabia would have called rapier thrusts. And so they were a sort of nascent special force. And so when Commando's thinking of a name, he thinks, I need a brand, I need a name. I'll call them Commandos, which is a bit weird because that's Britain's nemesis, but he calls them that. And the night of the Dunkirk evacuation, he pitches that to Dill, and Dill goes, Dill knows Churchill. And he goes, this is what we need, because Churchill's just taken over, and Churchill wants the offensive spirit, he wants this. He says, can you draft that for me? He drafts it that night, gives it in the morning, and by lunchtime that day, so Chief of General Staff meet that morning, by lunch that time that day, the commander's in business. And 3 weeks later, Clark is in a boat, an RAF crash boat over the channel with a commando unit. Yeah. So that's the start of Special Forces, really.
And there is an operation, actually, and I know I'm not going to be very good on exact dates. That's what you're here for.
Oh,
Tom.
brilliant!
But,
yeah, I'm hopelessly dyslexic. That's good. I've got my book to hand. Here we go.
Right. You mentioned Churchill, and this is right up Churchill Street, isn't it? But there's an operation that takes place in southern Italy that I was interested in, about destroying the aqueduct.
Yeah.
And Churchill's outraged when he learns that the operation went ahead.
Yes, he's outraged. One of the problems that commandos have, well, this is Clark's idea. One of the things Clark is doing with the commandos and then the SAS is he's creating a fictional force that is bigger and more powerful than it really is. So, he's got the press release ready to go before the commando raid takes place. And the same in the desert with the SAS. He gets the SAS up on Pathé newsreels and stages it like it's a massive unit. He's creating this illusion. But the problem with the press is Churchill's not in control of that. And particularly with the parachute drop in southern Italy, Churchill is worried that because we've demonstrated to the Italians and the Axis powers and the Germans how effective that parachute raid was, they might do it to us, which is a bit of I think he's just got miffed because he didn't know about it. But to go back a bit, that is the creation of the SAS, or the name of the SS, because all these commando units are running around, and Clark wants one of them to be parachute units. He knows about parachute units because he's seen the Germans in Norway. He's there at the start of the war. The Germans used gliders to take out the forts ahead of the Blitzkrieg in Holland. And he knows this is, and then after that, the British and the Irish get terrified of parachuting. It's something that it's a sort of, it's like a bogeyman, and they start rushing around and creating lots of defenses. He said, that's perfect for my subliminal methods. If you want to scare the enemy, pretend you've got parachute units. So he turns one of the commandos, 2 commando, into parachute unit, and they start parachute training up at Ringway. But what happens really is Churchill sort of Marlborough-esque ambitions for the British counteroffensives are far bigger than the reality. So he wants when he hears about airborne forces, he wants an airborne tank, and he wants 2,000 men. I mean, we're fast forwarding to what happens at Market Garden, basically. But that's what Churchill wants. But we're talking 1940, and we're fighting the Battle of Britain. We just don't have the resources. And so the parachute commando unit, 2 commando, gets pulled out of the army, essentially. They go, look, we can't support this. It gets given to the RAF. And the one thing that's bugged the staff officers about the name commando is it's taken from the Boers. And every forces that are not regular are supposed to be called Special Service, SS. And Clark goes, well, now you've got an enemy called the SS. You can't run around calling all the special forces SS because we've got the Waffen SS. It's a bit, but they go on calling it. Even throughout the war, they call them Special Service. So with glee, the moment 2 commando gets pulled out of the army and sent to the RAF, a staff officer types up Special Air Service. And that's how the name the SAS comes about. So that unit gets created. And then you're right, that unit gets dropped on Italy because an engineer from Holborn identifies that the Pulian aqueduct, if we blow that, it might derail the Italian campaign in Albania, which was a brilliant strategic target. I mean, it's what special forces are all for, and they do this amazing job. They parachute in. Unfortunately, they all get captured. But it terrifies Mussolini. So there you go. It's sort of the subliminal methods are all about putting this subliminal fear in the mind of the enemy, which is what Clark's concept was.
With the creation of the Special Air Service, then of course this is done without David Stirling.
That's correct. Yeah. It's not David Stirling. there are people in the unit who end up in the SAS, like a very famous chap called Tony Dean Drummond. I think he drops in on, I'm not quite sure, but anyway, he ends up in the Malayan campaign. That's complete. We are so far ahead of that. Let's stop. That's gone a completely different direction. Anyway, but no, there's no connection between that unit and what happens in North Africa, save for the fact that Clark by then has been posted to North Africa. So he gets recruited by Wavell, same man who sets Bagnall out into the desert with the long-range desert group. Wavell knows Clark because he's worked with him in Palestine during the Palestinian insurgency of 1936, 1937. And so he's basically what Wavell's about. Wavell's running the whole Middle East, and he's got too much on his plate. And so he's a master of strategic deception, and he wants to create fake units. So he calls Clark out there. He says, I need you to start faking stuff. But the first thing he gets Clark to fake is actually an operation in East Africa, which goes very well. But that becomes the playbook for what Clark then does. And the second thing he does, Clark finds out by mistake that we're going to drop parachutists on southern Italy. And they're dropping right down at the heel. So that unit it comes from Malta. Actually, the whole operation, bizarrely, is staged, I think, from Mildenhall to Malta to southern Italy, which is nuts in 1941, I think it is. It's nuts. It's an absolutely nuts operation. That operation logically would have come from the Middle East, which is much closer. So Clark goes, well, why don't we pretend that unit came from the Middle East? So he starts pretending that we have a parachute unit called the SAS in the Middle East. And that is the start of the deception that will eventually lead to Sterling and Lewis and Maine and the real SAS.
Sterling, we've talked extensively on this podcast previously with Gavin Mortimer about Sterling and Maine, so I don't want to go into too much detail. And they obviously feature heavily in the book, but there are so many other characters as well who are fascinating, like Bill Fraser, Jot Lewis. These two individuals, and actually, reading towards the end of your book and what they do after the war as well. I mean, I know it sounds like I'm skipping ahead again, but they're sort of made for this kind of special forces work during the war.
Yeah. So I cover all of the bases that other people have covered in terms of. I think the thing you have to understand, and this is where I think my narrative considerably differs from everyone else's, is that the concept of special forces, and it doesn't matter if you talk about the SAS and Navy SEALs, SBS, whoever you talk about, is their strategic troops. So if I'm a second lieutenant and I'm in a cavalry regiment, say, I command 3 tanks, and if I'm an infantry battalion, I command 20 odd men. And my chain of command then works. I report to a major, who's my company commander, squadron leader. He reports to a colonel, who's the regiment or battalion level. He reports to a brigadier. He reports to a divisional commander, to a general. And then finally, at the top of the cake, there's a general who's the force commander. And what Wavell set up from day one when he spoke to Bagnall, so Bagnall's in his office, pitches the idea, and immediately pitches the idea. Wavell says, yeah, well, you can have whatever you want. And he calls in General Arthur Smith, who's his consigliere. Now, Bagnall's expecting what would happen in the army normally is you get a Clark. Clark goes, okay, come down to, man, I won't use all the abbreviations, but come down to manpower. Let's find you some vehicles. Let's find you some troops. That's how the army works. You go right back down the food chain to the bottom. Forget that. Wavell connects. He says, this man gets whatever, and he reports to me. So that strategic connection is very important. So if you look at the SAS, for example, and the creation of it from inside the unit, the people in the unit don't really know what's going on. And that's no offense to all the great people like Sea Kings and all the others I talk about. But, we have a saying in the military, which is, at that level, you are mushrooms, you're kept in the dark and fed on shit because you don't know the whole picture. But in the SAS, the officers do, because they are reporting direct in to the highest force commander. And that strategic kind of role is set up right at the beginning with the LRDG, which then feeds into the SAS. So I went off track. We're going to talk about phrases.
No, that's really interesting, because that makes it nice and clear, because often it's a bit difficult to know. Is it still like that, the SAS, in that it sort of bypasses certain...
I can't, so I'm covered by the official secret, but I think we can establish that...
I've never had someone say that to me on the podcast before.
No, unfortunately, there were so many... there were so many disclosures that when I got there, I actually had to sign it. It's quite draconian. I mean, they basically don't talk about it. But what I do think I can say is that historically, and I would say that it's not any pretense that if you watch the film, what film is it where they go after Osama bin Laden? So SEAL Team 6, the person watching the TV is, which president were we in? I've forgotten. Was it Obama? Yeah, Obama.
Yeah, it was about the film is that Zero Dark 30?
Yeah, and so who's watching when the Iranian? I mean, this is also in a film, so I can tell you. But when you're watching the Iranian embassy siege go down, it's Margaret Thatcher.
Who dares wins?
Yeah. So the unit always reports the highest person. Now, if that's in theatre, that's the force commander, like Wavell, and if it's in Britain, that would be Churchill. Which is why Churchill's so pissed off about the 11 SAS raid on Italy. Though he had been told, he just missed it. Pargisme hadn't really given him enough of a heads up. I think they underestimated the strategic impact of what was going on. Well, they did. They completely missed the dropping parachutes on southern Italy. But part of the reason they miss it is because besides the parachutes and dropping southern Italy, Clark has started the deception. And Clark's deceptions is a very detailed and clever deception in the mind of Mussolini. So Mussolini has basically created all these genocides in Africa. He's persecuted the Zanussi, he's killed the Abyssinians, he's basically raped and murdered throughout North Africa. And so Clark thinks what would be terrifying is to pretend we're training Abyssinians, the SAS are taking Abyssinians, we're training them up, and we're going to throw them out of aircraft over southern Italy, which of course is a bit bonkers, but this is Mussolini. And it's that Sun Tzu saying of know your enemy. He knows his enemy. He knows this slightly paranoid, lunatic, fascist dictator. This is the sort of thing might freak him out. It does completely freak him out. It completely freaks him out.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's a wonderful part of it, as you're reading about that. Another part that's interesting that may have echoes today, which you're probably not allowed to speak about either, which is the, I guess it's called selection, isn't it? And selection for the early version of the SAS involves hurling people off moving vehicles to simulate parachuting.
Yeah, I'd say that's a part of it, but that's because they don't have a parachute instructor. That's literally because it's trial and error. So if you watch the footage, and you can get this online, in fact, I'll probably find a link for you. The Pathé news footage of the reel that Clark creates that goes out as a newsreel of them parachuting, they're doing it completely wrong. So basically, because they don't have a parachute instructor, the RAF, who all the RAF have been to that point in the Middle East, is throwing out bundles for Clark with parachutes attached to them to pretend there are parachutists. So when Sterling...
Because this is, sorry to interrupt you, but this is because we spoke to Mark Urban, or rather, yeah. I spoke to Mark Urban a few months ago, because Britain was quite late to the whole parachuting game.
Yeah, I think we were late, but Ringway, where they would, yes, we were late, and it was a little bit trial and error, but Ringway in England, they had terrible problems. I cover the development in my book, and actually I think Mark Urban, he talks about that as well. I cover the early development. So the SAS leads to one para eventually, or the parachute regiment. But early on they have terrible problems because nobody knows what they're doing. They're somersaulting out of aircraft, tangling up their lines. I mean, essentially going out of an aircraft with or without kit, you want to get a clean exit, get away from the fuselage, and then the static line behind you pulls the chute out clean. Anything that messes with that can be potentially disastrous, which David Sterling experiences when he dives out as if going into water, which is what the RAF tend to do because they don't have a clue what they're talking about. And you look at that footage, they're all diving out of the aircraft, and it's bonkers because, I mean, logically, the chute's attached with a line physically inside the aircraft. If you dive, the chances are you could tumble. They call that somersaulting, or spin. And any of that prevents the chute deploying properly. So if the chute deploys while you're spinning, it does something called candle, which means it literally wraps up, and then you haven't got a proper chute. Or if you rip it on the fuselage, which is what happened to Sterling, you land like a ton of whatever. And actually, as you know, and everyone, I think this has been covered, they lose 2 guys in training because the static line breaks, or the O-ring that holds it in the aircraft breaks. So this is all erratic. So all of that is just trial and error and a bit of a mess. But the bit that's crucial about what you'd now call selection is Jock Lewis, who's this amazing training officer, and the 2 people that Sterling was really after were Jock Lewis because of his training, and Carol Mather was the other one. Those are the 2 officers from 8 Commando, both because, well, Jock Lewis, amazing training. He'd been up in Tobruk running this little outfit, and Mather had been actually using Clark's Eureka boats, which were like early assault craft, to try and get behind Rommel's lines. That hadn't worked out. Anyway, Mather turns him down, but Lewis joins him, and that's a bit of a game changer because I think, and Sterling gets a lot of flack. I think basically what I would say about that is there would be no SAS without Sir David Stirling. He had his faults. He was organizationally not good, but he was what I call a military entrepreneur. He got it going. He got in front of the right people and he sold it. And Clark backed him, I think, because when he met him, he saw this guy and went, that guy can sell stuff. And he did. He sold it to Ritchie, he sold it to Auchinleck. He was the man. And then him and Clark exaggerated everything to make sure this unit became what it became. But Jock Lewis, the selection thing was, they didn't have selection, but they did have something pretty tough, which was the Lewis marches, these long marches through the desert, because their first operation was going to be this operation where they parachute in behind lines and then they've got to navigate out. So Lewis understood, not got much kit, going to be on a foot, got to navigate in the desert, might have all your team down, so it might be you on your own. All of the stuff that we know from modern special forces sort of started really with Lewis and that training.
I might have annoyed a SAS veteran interviewing him by suggesting that maybe SAS selection was a little bit more relaxed than the Navy SEALs, which seems to go on for like a year or something.
Interesting, that
I'm not sure the word relaxed was the right one to use.
The Navy SEALs sit up to their neck in mud for 8 hours, so that can teach you something, which is, can I sit in the mud for 8 hours up to my neck? I think I'm going to say, I'm going to get into the row now. I would say that what you need people who can think on their feet. And the thinking part, and I get this a lot, and I've got a good mate, no secret, that Billy Billingham, who does he does that show, SAS.
Oh, yeah, the reality show, SAS.
So that's one aspect, which is the aspect where you've got to have people who are mentally and physically fit enough to do the job. And that's the bit that everyone focuses on. They focus on the sort of physical attributes and the mental resilience. But of course, if you look at what the SS has to do, and you can look at it in a second, well, they have to think. They're out there doing a strategic job on their own. Sometimes the targets aren't even there. They've really got to think on their feet. So that whole aspect, you can sit up to your neck in the mud, right? That's fine. That's one aspect. That's kind of a given. It's kind of at the base level. You've got to have people who are that fit and are that resilient. Then on top of that, you've got to have people, NCOs and junior officers, who, and I'm saying that because they'll be the people on the ground who are capable of taking the initiative when needed and thinking on their feet. That's it.
And do the officers go through the same test as the?
Here we go. Official secrets.
You're not allowed to say.
Disclose. I mean, obviously, officers get tested. No, everything's the same. I think I can say this. I think people know enough. Everything's the same. Obviously, there's an aptitude thing to be an officer, which is different. Obviously, because there would have to be, wouldn't there?
Yeah.
But then again, the NCOs have that because the different. Right, I'm going to stop talking now because I'm not sure where I am with this.
Yeah. No, I don't want to get you in trouble.
Yeah, I think that's enough on that. That's enough of that. Let's talk about the Second World War.
Well, yes, and now there's one individual in the book who is quite controversial character, actually, Eric Dorman Smith. Now, this is quite a niche piece of information for the listeners, so that I doubt he's particularly well known, but he was very famous for planning, I think, helping to plan what became the Battle of El Alamein. Is that
he has my analogy for him would be Dominic Cummings. They call him the evil genius. He's hated by most of his staff, right? However, and this is something I think that's important about the Special Forces story, is the military entrepreneurs, the creatives, and the iconoclasts are absolutely vital to that story. Of course, you can't have everyone in an organization behaving like that, but you need some people who really get it, and he really gets it. So Eric Dorman Smith, the evil genius, he's kind of kept out. He is very talented, I would say, extremely talented, but he's kept out in the cold, and he is only really brought in by the General Auchinleck. But he sees the potential. He basically, when he hears about the long-range desert group, he's good friends with Ernest Hemingway, who he's friends with between the war. He gets shell shocked. So he fights in I'll tell you just his brief history, because I don't think your audience will know about Eric Dorman Smith, but I think he probably deserves a lot more attention than he gets. So he wins one of the first military crosses in the First World War. He actually gets shell shocked. So he gets home and his father finds him in the garden, catatonic in the dark, in a house they don't even live in, but they used to live in. And from there, he gets sent to Italy to recover. And there he meets, on Armistice Day, he's in a bar having a drink, and a man who's wearing the Italian Medal of Honor, though he's wearing civilian clothes, next to him is having a beer. And armistice happens, and he says, oh, that's that. Let's have a drink. And that man is Ernest Hemingway, and they become best friends. So between the war, he's part of the lost generation. He goes to, Paris, and he does all that. And that's an extraordinary thing for an army officer of that generation, if you think about all the people he will have met and hung out with in that sort of very creative world. But then in the Second World War, he can't really get into the war because he's so disliked. They shut him out. He causes so many...
My grandfather came up against him at Anzio.
Really? Oh, tell me the story. What happened?
He was so my grandfather won 2 DSOs, one of which was at Anzio, and so he was a battalion commander.
Oh.
And his brigade commander was Dorman Smith.
Yeah.
And him and 2 of his fellow battalion commanders were trying to get Dorman Smith to leave his headquarters to come up to see what was going on. And I think this is the criticism they had, was that he basically refused. He wanted to stay back.
He did.
And I think they mutinied almost. I mean, that sounds terrible, but you could describe it as mutiny. I think they went to the divisional commander and stated that they refused to serve with him. But I could be getting things wrong as well, having not really researched it.
I mentioned that in the book. That's very interesting. That's how they finally do him in. So obviously, for a man who's fought in the First World War, has had shell shock, sending him into the Anzio beachhead as an older officer, he was too old for that command. To give him that command was a sort of poison chalice. And I suspect, though I could never prove, that that's why they did it. Because when Churchill wanted to reinstate him because Churchill saw him as talented. So he got fired as part of what's called the Cairo Purge, which is when General Claude Auchinleck got fired as well. So Churchill came over, as he said, he was going to behead the beautiful stag that was Auchinleck. He was going to fire everyone. It was called the Cairo Purge because they fired everyone. Rommel thought we were stupid. He said, it's like changing England managers every time that you don't win a game. It's like, well, they were doing badly for lots of reasons, but you've just fired the entire management there. But which is what they did, and that's when then Monty comes in and things like that. Alexander comes. So at that point, Dorman Smith is back out in the cold. We'll talk about what happens to him before that, but back out in the cold. And it's Churchill who reinstates him, and he ends up in Anzio because of course we know Anzio is a disaster, and he's there basically fighting trench warfare, having done that in the First War. It's even that type of warfare as anathema to him because he hates that. That's what not he's about. And I think we need to be clear. There's a sort of, I don't know how people understand how much you need to distinguish between staff and command, which is 2 different things in the British Army. Dorman Smith's definitely a staff officer, and he's a senior officer. He has ideas. He's not someone you really want to put back in the front line, but that doesn't mean he's not a good officer.
Right, that's interesting. He ends up in the IRA.
He does indeed. He actually had those sympathies before because of his Irish roots. His nanny is caught. This is the original RA, not the provisional. This is back before the war. His nanny's caught. He finds out he's over there as part of the British Army, and he finds out his nanny has been helping some local IRA members, and he shelters her. He hides her. What he does is he finds out where the cash is, and he moves the arms cache. Yeah,
it's a very interesting story.
After the war, he goes back that way. But the reason he's important because he is really an ideas man. As they say, he fires off 1,000 ideas a day. Some are rubbish, some are good. But he's the one who, when Auchinleck takes over, he basically describes the LRDG as being like the guerrillas in For Whom the Bells Tolls, which has just come out. So Hemingway's book. And he sees the potential special forces, and him and Claude Auchinleck are big sponsors of special forces. Auchinleck gets a lot of criticism later on for sponsoring Sterling, and when he gets to the Far East, he actually doesn't sponsor Wingate for that reason because he's had his fingers burnt by the Sterling experience. But the tempting thing, and I mentioned this in the book, is that the way the Second Battle of Alamein is fought, which is fought by Montgomery, of course, was not the way that Dorman Smith thought it should be fought. In his appreciation, that there's something in the military called a combat appreciation, which is where you analyze your enemy, then write a plan. And that's actually just a piece of fact. He wrote that one of the options was to go round the flank at Seir Oasis, which is what's called the indirect approach. We can talk about that a bit, rather than what Monty did, which is a full frontal massacre, wood chopping. What Lawrence Arabia would have called wood chopping, yeah.
I just wanted to talk a little bit about Clark after the SAS are established. But he seems like a completely irrepressible character.
Yeah, he is.
I mean, he's been depicted in the TV show by the TV show that's just come out by Dominic West.
Yeah.
How accurate is that?
I don't think it's accurate, but I love Dominic West. I thought we probably aren't going to talk about it, but I thought that he was. I could be rude to everyone. I shouldn't say this. I might work with him, but I thought he was a brilliant character. I thought he really was a show stealer. When he appears in that, and he appears in the dress because that is actually something that happens. Clark.
The picture in the book of him in a dress.
Yeah, the picture in the book. So the variant. This is why the Special Forces story is interesting, because to go back to the people who are the l'étrangers, the outsiders in any military narrative, they are the people who start it. We mentioned Bill Fraser. He's gay. Clark's a cross-dresser. You couldn't say Sterling. Jock Lewis is probably the most normal of the lot, I think, in the early days. But he is irrepressible. He has ideas, and he has a very funny space in the military in that generals just know his talents, and he gets called in every time there's trouble. They go, let's get Clark in. Let's get Clark in. Wavell does it. Auchinleck does it. Even Alexander, we just talked about Anzio, when the whole of the Italian campaign's bogged down because basically we've landed on the heel of Italy. And as one German dissenter says, if you're going to invade Italy, don't start at the bottom. It's a terrible plan. And so the winter of, I think it's 43, I can't get my dates right, 43. The British command are sort of struggling. Everyone's falling out with each other. Monty and Patton are having rows. And they don't know what to do. And they ring Clark. So Alexander says to Clark, well, what do we do? He flies him over there. So what do we do? And Clark comes up with the genius plan of, the British are already going to land at Anzio. He says, well, you wouldn't do that. You'd land further north, which is Rommel's assessment. So the thing about Clark, when he comes up with these plans, they're usually better than the real plan, and the enemy anticipated. So Rommel anticipates in that case, British landing up by the Po Valley, cutting Italy off at the head, and Clark dreams up a plan just further south. So when he runs that deception, the Germans go, oh, of course they're going to do that. And they send all their forces north, and the troops at Anzio wade ashore unopposed. And for 2 days, it takes 2 days for the Germans to react. Of course, we're not going to cover Anzio. We know that's a disaster because nothing happens. We just sit around doing nothing for 2 days, which is not a good idea in war.
So Clark, post-war, his career, and I know this is about the SS during the war, but I found him such an interesting character that I just want to talk a little bit about him post-war, because it's similar to Fraser. Post-war, that their lives are really sort of empty, aren't they, in a way?
Well, yeah. I think the tragedy for Clark is he is. I would love maybe. I've done this. Maybe there will be a biography. Maybe there could be a film about him. He really needs to be moved up a gear. To tell the story. He gets a paragraph, sometimes a page. In the narrative of the SAS. To tell the story about Special Forces Second World War without mentioning Clark is not an omission. It's just not a story. It's not the story. But yes, after the war, he does write his first book, which you can buy and read, which is the biography, his autobiography of the first years, and that takes you up to when he gets to Cairo, essentially. So, but he doesn't really mention the SAS in that. He just mentions the commandos, and in that section, he doesn't mention that mission that I write about Ireland, because he's in fact I found those files in the.
That was fascinating. The section on Ireland is fascinating.
Yeah, I had a real moment. Sometimes you're digging in the archive, you have a moment and go, oh my word, nobody's seen this. And those, and I'll tell everyone now, all you historians out there, those files in the Imperial War Museum, and they're going to have to do something about filing them or digitize them, because everyone should have a read. So that chapter is redacted by the censor, and they take it out because nobody can talk about the fact that we were trying to persuade Ireland to come into the war, and Clark had been sent there to advise their army on how to defend against the German invasion. But you can imagine how different the Second World War would have been had that happened, had that mission worked, had Churchill been able to sell the idea of us deploying forces into Ireland. The Atlantic War would look completely different. Extraordinary. That mission's extraordinary. That happens. That book's published, but obviously there's lots of things in that book you can't talk about that I talk about. So you can read that, but then read mine, and then you'll see what the truth of what he's saying is. You get more detail. And then he's sort of fishing around, really, because he knows where all the bodies are buried, and other people don't. And I mentioned the Operation Mincemeat, right? So Ewan Montague goes off and he talks about how great his operation is, and he publishes his own book, becomes a film. It must have been incredibly frustrating for Clark to sit there going, yeah, that was really that was the sardine when I had the shark. You know, I was the guy who did that, and he's got these other people who were essentially underlings, and the guy he casts to play Montgomery. So he casts an actor to play Montgomery to deceive the Germans that Monty's in the Mediterranean just before the Normandy landing. And he writes a book. He writes, you know, I was Monty's double, and that happens, that comes out. So Clark's sitting there going, well, they're being drip fed part of a massive, you know, narrative that I created. And he wants to write the book, and he wants to call it The Secret War. And it would have been spectacular. No, he's a good writer. That would have been one of the defining accounts or memoirs of the Second World War. But the censor prevented him. The War Office, no, we've got the Russians, you know, we've got to deal with the Cold War. This will be useful. But it isn't useful, because what they do is he does write an internal document, which is called the A-Force Diary, which is about four folders worth. It's a huge document, actually. It's worth going through, because it has absolute gems in there. I've just skated over the surface of what he did. But they stick that in the archive, and they lose it. I mean, literally, not literally lose it, it's filed. But you have someone at Sandhurst later on in the 60s going, you know, he gets in touch with Clark. I heard you wrote a book about deception in the Second War. I'm trying to work out, you know, deception in Germany in the Cold War. He goes, and Clark goes, there's no book. The MOD have got it all. I think, and the Sandhurst guy goes, oh, well, I'll go look for it then. So all this information lost, and he tries fiction, but that doesn't really work out for him, because unlike his brother, I think, and I'd say this, I don't want to, you know, I think I can write. I'm big in myself. I can write.
You can.
Out of the army a while. I think it's quite hard when you're in the army, because the writing in the army is very terse, very abbreviated. And I think Clark just struggled, because obviously when he wrote, it's called The Golden Arrow, it was written on the back of Ian Fleming's first Bond book. And so I think the publisher thought, oh, well, you know, Fleming was a spy. He can do this. I've got Clark. He's an even bigger spy. This book's going to be brilliant. It's actually just not very good, which is a tragedy, because in the archive, he's obviously destroyed all record of it. All the offer letter, everything's gone. The first book is there with all the memos and, you know, stuff from the publisher, but the second one, no, it's completely gone.
Yeah, it is quite sad reading about his post-war career, actually. So it's a real pleasure to have you on, also because not only have you written this fantastic book, but you're a filmmaker, and I'd watched your film The Patrol, which I think came out in 2013. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, it was released 2014, but it won the Raindrops Film Festival 2013. Yeah.
And it's a very interesting. Just for the listeners, it's an account of a platoon on patrol in Afghanistan during the recent war in Afghanistan. So British patrol, and it's all about the psychology between. At least this is what I took from it, the psychology between officers and men, and how they deal with those relationships in a really highly stressful situation.
Yeah. I mean, it's a sort of, I mean, in a way, I think it could almost have been a play, because I'll be really
it reminded me of Journey's End, actually, while I was watching.
Yeah. You're on the money there. Journey's End, or The Long, the Short, and the Tall, or one of those ones, you know. And that was my idea, was that because I wrote, one thing, having been in the business a while, I wrote for the budget. We had hardly any money. I don't know if that shows up on screen. It does sometimes.
Well, I think actually it worked. I mean, it was obvious. It was pretty clear to see. Yes, it's low budget, but I think that worked to the advantage, because not showing the I don't want to give anything away, actually. Not showing certain things allows you to see your mind. But
also I think that's the truth. So I think one of the things that happen, and this is a much bigger discussion, but one of the things that happens in war movies is they compress everything. So they put loads of stuff on the screen to make it look great. It's just rubbish. You don't see any of that. You know, you never see anyone. You never see who's shooting at you. That's for sure. I mean, you never. Well, you do eventually, maybe, but like, no.
You filmed it in Morocco, didn't you?
Morocco, yeah, same latitude as Afghanistan. So we went out to Morocco, just outside Marrakesh, and I got a bit lucky actually with that. And that's why I think it looks quite good, is, I say that myself, is that it was a Berber village. So if you know anything about the history of Morocco, actually Morocco's in my book as well, the Rif War is in my book. But anyway, the Berbers got sort of moved on, and there was a deserted Berber village that we found just outside Marrakesh. I should probably shout out to James Cutting, who died recently. He was a fixer out there who found it. My wife and I, he took us out to the desert. We drove around and found this place, amazing place. And we stayed in a nearby oasis. So the shoot was brilliant. Yeah, we did it in 3 weeks, I believe. Yeah, 3 weeks shooting, and that's what we did. Yeah.
The cast, how did you cast the actors?
So they were all unknowns. I mean, Ben Wrighton, probably know you. Owen Arthur's gone on and he's in the modern Hobbit. I think he's one of the Hobbits. Yeah, I mean, we just did a casting. We had a casting director. They had to be young. They didn't have any military training. But what I really noticed with the military side of it was that how fast actors, they just absorb stuff, and they got so fast with their weapon drills. And there was a point, actually I put the shot in the film, there was a point where I was watching them on the horizon, and then it was getting dark. We were filming them because we just got them to patrol around. And I thought, yeah, they do look like a kind of rough, probably quite an experienced unit, but they don't look that off. They're not that far away. They're doing the drills, they know how to use the weapons, they look like they're doing the job. Yeah. Actors are like that. Actors are that's a fantastic skill actors have. They're able to absorb all that information.
So obviously the war in Afghanistan is of great interest to you. I wonder what your view was of the West, Britain and America's withdrawal, or America's withdrawal, and then we left as well. But in 2021...
I mean, I knew it was going to happen. I mean, that's why I made the film, and it's in the film. I said, well, at the moment we leave, they're going to go back in. I mean, we go back and talk about, troop surges back in Palestine in 1936. The trouble with troop surges is they put a lid on a pressure cooker. As soon as you take the lid off, it's gone. The only realistic way to deal with there's two things about any insurgency. Let's forget Afghanistan. First of all, you have to find out what the root cause of insurgency is and provide an alternative narrative to it. So if you haven't got a political solution, you're wasting your time. Secondly, you need to persuade local forces to do the job. That's it. There's no point deploying your own. I mean, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Palestine, when the British Army were over there, pouring troops into the problem is always the worst solution. You might need troops, but, and talking about the history of the SAS, we went into Amman and Dhofar and trained local tribes people there, Furka, to do. And that I'm saying that because that's public knowledge now. That's ideally what you do. You don't want to be using your own forces. And actually, we mentioned this. I said one of my favorite films is Battle of Algiers. Great movie, which is, they should probably sit everyone down, every officer down in junior, whatever, Sandhurst, West Point, and make them watch that film, basically, because that's the manual.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I don't know if you've read Lawrence Friedman's book recently, Command, which deals with political and military leaderships during wars post World War II, and he goes into Algeria in quite a lot of detail, and it's fascinating.
I'll read that because that's such an interesting time. But that film is, and you've got a real. He was in the Foreign Legion, wasn't he? Jean Martin. He was the guy who plays the para colonel in that. Was a real.
And I think there were veterans on both sides. I think in
and it looks absolutely, But what's great about that is there's a moment, and I don't want to ruin it. Actually, you can get it. I've noticed that these films are coming back now because they're putting them out through. I think Amazon's got that one. They have a classics thing going on, so you can actually just Google the Battle of Algiers and look at it. But there's a great moment when they plant the first, what we call now IEDs, bombs, and it's done by 3 women. This is a spoiler alert. Switch off now if you don't want me to ruin the plot. But anyway, and there's just that scene where you go to the 3 women, and they're each in one's in a airline office, the other one's in a bar, and the other one's in a kind of dancing club, and they look around at all the innocent people they're about to kill because they're planting bombs. And it's a great moment. You go, those women who've got children are going through with this. They're planting the bomb. But because the story's built up so cleverly, you go, yeah, I kind of get that. And if you want to know why someone can be a suicide bomber, that's a great film to look at the psychology of, and then why you're going to lose the war. Because you're going to lose. Once you got to that point, that war's, you've gone off the rails.
Yeah, the French commander is saying this to the leadership, isn't he? He's saying, I can make tactical wins. That's I can do that.
I can chop off as many heads as you want, and it won't solve the problem. Yeah, that is counterinsurgency warfare in a nutshell. Yeah.
Well, it's been so interesting hearing about the early days of special forces and guerrilla tactics from the SAS, from your book, and Dudley Clark is just it's opened me up to this whole life of this fascinating man. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Yep.
If you enjoyed that and haven't listened yet, I spoke with Gavin Mortimer on the so-called founder of the SAS, David Stirling. And I chatted with Gavin on the BBC TV series SAS Rogue Heroes recently, so I think this pod is now covered for the early years of the SAS, for now.
Coming up, I've got an Oscar-nominated director, a chat and quiz with two 17th century experts, and I'm going to be introducing the Aspects of History Film Club with friend of the show and director Tim Hewitt. I do hope you can subscribe and rate and review if you can. Until then, thank you and good night.